kind of rain that bleeds into the stones and stays there, the sort that leaves the air tasting faintly of iron and the river's slow breath. I had taken my usual seat in the back corner of the King's Arms, facing the door but far enough from it that I could pretend not to be waiting for anyone. The whisky was warm in my hand, its amber surface shifting with the faint tremor of footsteps on the old timber floor. Two men sat close enough for their voices to arrive to me in hesitant fragments, not loud but persistent, as though the subject required a certain secrecy, yet longed to be overheard. They spoke of a funeral that morning. Thomas Black, retired bursar from one of the smaller colleges, a man, they said, who knew how to stretch a budget and pinch a supplier, who could calculate a deficit without removing his spectacles, and a wife, still living, with manners cold enough to keep the years at bay. She hadn't cried, apparently. Not once. The younger of the two remarked on this with the relish of someone who has never had to stand at the edge of a grave. The older man only murmured something I didn't catch, and for a moment I was glad I hadn't. I told myself it was nothing of interest. People grieve as they must, or as they can. Tears are not a certificate of loss. I turned my glass, slow circles on the damp ring it had left. Outside, the lamps of St. Giles shimmered through the mist like oil on water. The conversation at the next table faded into the shapeless murmur of the pub, the scrape of cutlery, a sudden burst of laughter from near the bar, the faint hiss of beer being pulled. I might have let the morning's funeral drift into that same oblivion had it not been for the paper. Someone had left a folded Oxford Mail on the seat beside me, creased neatly in half, the damp of the rain still in its fibres. I glanced at the headlines, a pedestrian injured on the Botley Road, a minor scandal in the council, and then, without thinking, my eye fell to the classifieds. There it was, a small square of type in the memoriam section. 2 lines, for Thomas Black, and then the couplet, "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." It was the sort of thing one might find in any second-hand poetry book on the Broad, between pressed flowers and forgotten receipts. Only it wasn't quite right. The rhythm had been altered, clipped at the edge like a coin shaved down to cheat a scale. Tennyson's line, the one lodged in the mind of anyone who had ever pretended to read in memoriam, was not exactly this. The misquote was slight enough that it might have been nothing. But it was deliberate enough, I thought, that it might have been something. I closed the paper and placed it back on the seat, exactly as I had found it. The 2 men beside me had left without my noticing, their empty glasses still wet with condensation. A draught curled in from the door as it opened and shut. Somewhere down Walton Street. The rain thickened. It was not the first time I'd been drawn to a case by something too small to justify the pull it exerted. A misplaced comma, a chord played too slowly, a step taken at the wrong moment on the wrong pavement. These things lingered, the way a minor note lingers in the air after the rest of the music has resolved. I left the King's Arms just after 9, the whisky's warmth no match for the rain's quiet persistence. Jericho lay ahead, all wet brick and closed curtains, the canal holding its reflections like a patient mirror. I walked without hurry, and without reason I could name, toward the street where Thomas Black had once lived. The misquoted line stirred again in my mind, like a door not quite shut. Lewis drove. I let him, content to watch the long streets of North Oxford unfold, the pale terraces and slow-swaying gardens, the raindrops drawing transparent rivulets down the car window. There is a quiet in that part of the city that feels almost deliberate, as though the houses have agreed among themselves not to betray the lives inside them. The Blacks' home stood behind a low brick wall, its iron gate flaking in the corners. Ivy had climbed without restraint over the old Victorian facade, thick enough to make the stonework seem older than it was. The windows gave nothing away, no movement, no shadow, just a steady reflection of the wet afternoon. Margaret Black received us in a drawing room where the curtains were drawn halfway, leaving the light soft and insufficient. Lavender clung to the air, and beneath it a drier scent, the long-closed kind of dust that settles only in places seldom moved. She spoke with the measured courtesy of someone for whom conversation is an obligation rather than a pleasure. Lewis took the chair she indicated. I preferred to stand, though I told myself it was because my coat was still damp. She said her husband had died peacefully in his sleep. The doctor had been called, the certificate issued. No mystery in it. Her eyes met mine without flinching, though they offered nothing I could take away. While Lewis asked about the funeral arrangements, I let my gaze travel. A chessboard sat on a small table by the window, pieces mid-game, one knight already fallen beside the board. The black queen stood oddly exposed, a single pawn guarding her. It looked like a game paused not the night before but months ago, the dust gathering on the ivory. Along the far wall stood a row of poetry volumes, each spine precisely in line, their gold lettering dulled by time. Only one, a slim, green-bound edition of Tennyson, jutted forward a fraction, as though it had been returned in haste. I thought of the misquoted couplet in the paper. Lewis, more straightforward in his attentions, had noticed a photograph on the mantelpiece. He asked if it was her husband. She confirmed it. 4 young men in academic gowns stood together, their smiles uneven, the sort born of some private victory. The photograph had faded into a palette of greys and shadows. The faces were harder to read for it. I asked who the others were. She hesitated just enough for the silence to feel heavier than her answer. Old friends, she said. University days. She could not remember their names now. I thought this unlikely, but said nothing. On a small table beside her chair lay a library book, its dust jacket beginning to fray at the edges. I picked it up, more to feel the weight of it than from any interest in its contents. Inside the flap was the Bodleian stamp, the date of return several months overdue. I set it back where I had found it. She noticed but did not remark upon it. There was a moment when the lavender seemed to press too close, the air too still, a house that had been emptied, not of furniture or keepsakes, but of something harder to name. Even the ticking of the clock on the mantel felt cautious. Lewis closed his notebook. Margaret offered a brief, polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She saw us to the door, holding it just far enough open for us to pass into the damp air outside. As we walked back to the car, Lewis said she seemed calm enough. I agreed, though the word that came to mind was not calm but hollow, a quality you can sometimes hear in a voice before you see it in a face. Driving away, I glanced back at the house. The curtains in the drawing room had been drawn a little closer, shutting out what little light there had been. Somewhere inside, the chessboard still waited, the queen unguarded, the pawn holding its ground. The solicitor's office was a narrow affair above a shop on the high street, reached by a staircase that tilted slightly to the left, as though it had been conceding ground for decades. Mr. Eden received us with the weary civility of a man whose trade required him to be both keeper and gatekeeper of other people's secrets. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and tea left too long in its pot. He had Thomas Black's file ready before we sat down, a slim brown folder tied with a fraying ribbon. He untied it carefully, as if unfastening something more fragile than paper, and explained in his dry, hesitant voice that the will had been altered precisely 2 months before Mr. Black's death. The change was not, strictly speaking, extraordinary in its legal form, but in its spirit, perhaps. A considerable bequest, more than most households in Jericho might see in 10 years, had been left to a society I had never heard of, the Athenian Circle for the Preservation of English Verse, a name that sounded faintly ridiculous, like a private joke too long repeated. I asked Eden about the society. He gave the sort of vague reply that draped itself in propriety, but was lined with evasion. Small membership, literary focus, nothing improper as far as he knew. He did not meet my eye when he said it. I suggested lightly that such a bequest might surprise a widow. He adjusted his spectacles, glanced at a pile of correspondence that did not require his attention, and said he could not speak to family reactions, which was, of course, an answer in itself. As he pushed the folder towards himself again, I let my gaze fall to his desk. Among the papers was a crossword from the Times torn cleanly from the page. It was mostly filled in, the letters written in a careful, square hand. My eyes, unbidden, found 14 across, bereaved woman, left to pick up pieces, 5. The answer, in neat capitals, was WIDOW. The small symmetry of it was too neat to ignore. When Eden stepped away to retrieve a document, I slid the page under my own folder without ceremony. Lewis saw me do it, but said nothing. He knows the value I sometimes find in what others would call litter. When we left the office, the light outside was the colour of pewter, the rain threatening but undecided. Lewis, who had been silent through most of the meeting, waited until we had crossed the road before speaking. He had been using the waiting time to make his own inquiries, and in the practical way of policemen with fewer romantic illusions, he had results already. The photograph on the black's mantelpiece, 4 young men in gowns, had begun to yield names. 2 of them, Lewis told me, were now dead. Not recently, but not long enough ago to escape memory. One had drowned while sailing off the coast near Whitstable, his body found days later. The other had collapsed in the quad of his college after evensong. Both had been attributed to misfortune, the sea's indifference, the heart's sudden rebellion. But Lewis's tone suggested that coincidence was wearing thin. The 4th man, still living, had proved more elusive. An address in Summertown, an unconfirmed occupation. Lewis seemed prepared to keep pulling at that thread. We paused near the Sheldonian, the late afternoon turning the cobbles slick. I thought of the altered will, the strange society, and the crossword clue that had appeared, unbidden, perhaps, or perhaps with the quiet deliberation of someone who wanted it seen. There was something in the way Eden's eyes had slid past mine when I mentioned the widow that stayed with me, like the half-formed shape of a thought just out of reach. We parted at the corner, Lewis toward the station, I toward Broad Street. In my pocket, the crossword felt weightless, but I could not shake the sense that its answer, sitting plainly in black ink, was heavier than it appeared. St. Simeon's is one of those Oxford colleges that hides itself without seeming to. No great gatehouse, no bold coat of arms above the door, just an arched entrance you might pass 100 times before noticing. Inside, the quadrangles are small and self-contained, the stones softened by weather and the years. Rain had polished the flagstones to a muted gloss. Somewhere, unseen, a bell struck the quarter hour with the reluctance of an afterthought. I had arranged to meet 3 people who, if not suspects, were at least the sort of acquaintances whose names would survive in the margins of a man's history. The first was Dr. Adrian Selwyn, whose rooms overlooked the smaller of the quads. He opened the door with the kind of unstudied charm that only those well practised in it can carry off. His tie was a little loose, his books a little disordered, the whole scene calculated to suggest he was always in the middle of something more important than the present moment. We spoke in the shallow recess of his study, the shelves lined with the familiar spines of poetry anthologies and critical essays, none dusty enough to have gone untouched for long. When I asked about the Athenian circle, his expression shifted briefly. Not surprise exactly, but the flicker of someone presented with an unexpected test. He said he had never heard of it. His voice was smooth, but there was the faintest hesitation before the denial, like a cough stifled before it reached the throat. Lydia Mornay met me in the college chapel, where she was leafing through a score on the front pew. She was younger than I'd expected, with the kind of self-possession that needs neither hauteur nor apology. A music lecturer, and, according to my notes, Margaret Black's closest friend. The chapel smelled faintly of old wood and candle wax, the air cooler than the corridors outside. She listened to my questions without interruption, her fingers resting lightly on the open pages of the score, as though unwilling to let them go. No, she said, she had no knowledge of any poetry society. Then, in the pause that followed, she smiled faintly, almost to herself, and remarked that Thomas had been rather more passionate than prudent in his younger days. It was said lightly, but the weight of it lingered. When I asked her to elaborate, she demurred, claiming she was not in the habit of gossip, yet something in her tone suggested that passion and imprudence were not abstractions to her. The last of the 3 was Peter Vale, a bursary clerk with a face that had known better years. His handshake was too quick, his eyes quick to shift from mine. He led me to a small, tidy office that smelled faintly of damp paper. His records of Thomas Black's time as bursar were precise to the point of austerity, but Vale himself seemed less disciplined. Lewis had already hinted at a gambling habit in his past, not enough to cost him his job, but enough to leave its mark on his reputation. When I asked about the Athenian circle, his answer came faster than Selwyn's, and with less charm. Never heard of it. He folded his hands on the desk as though to signal the end of the conversation, but his left thumb moved restlessly against the other, tapping a slow rhythm. I left him with the sense of someone who knew more than was healthy to say aloud. Walking back through the cloisters, I found the rain had eased to a fine mist, softening the edges of the stone. Somewhere above, in one of the staircases, a piano was being played, a fragment of Schubert, halting and uncertain. I thought of Selwyn's polite evasion, Lydia's unguarded remark, Vale's restless thumb. None of them had given me anything solid, yet I could not shake the sense that all three were balancing on the same narrow beam, careful not to lean too far into the light. The quadrangle was empty as I crossed it. My footsteps echoed against the cloister walls, too loud for the distance I'd walked, as though the sound belonged to someone else, following just out of sight. The Bodleian on a wet afternoon has a particular kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of it, held in suspension like dust in a shaft of light. I had come there under no particular compulsion, only the faint tug of instinct, the way one sometimes finds oneself taking an old path, without remembering the reason it was first chosen. In the upper reading room, I let my steps drift among the shelves of 19th-century poetry, the air faintly metallic from the rain outside. My fingers moved along the spines without urgency, pausing when they found the green cloth of a Tennyson volume, Poems, 1830 to 1865, its edges worn, its title dulled to the colour of lichen. Inside the front cover, the fly-leaf bore a small printed slip, donated to the library by Thomas Black, 1973. The inscription beneath it was in a steady, old-fashioned hand, Michaelmas, 1968, and a short line in Latin, In memoriam veritatis et amoris, in memory of truth and love. There was also the faintest trace of something rubbed away above it, the page bruised where a pencil or pen had once left its mark. As I replaced the dust jacket, something thin and folded slid free, landing on the desk with a sound far too loud for the room. I caught it before it could fall to the floor, a letter, folded twice, the paper brittle at the edges. The hand was neat, rounded, unmistakably feminine. There was no date, no signature, and no address. It spoke, in unhurried lines, of a promise bound in verse, and of the way such promises might outlast the hands that made them. It was not a love letter in the conventional sense, but there was in it a kind of intimacy that could not have been meant for public reading. I read it twice, each time feeling the weight of its omissions as much as its words. A promise bound in verse, the phrase lingered, as though its meaning had been tucked away in some corner of the past where few could reach it. The librarian on duty, a man whose knowledge of the catalogue seemed to reside in muscle memory rather than reference books, recalled the donation. Black had given a small box of poetry volumes, mostly Victorian, in the early 70s. He could not say whether they had all been his own or acquired for the purpose. I carried the letter to Lewis, who had spent the day navigating the college's less cooperative records. He turned it in his hands, running a finger lightly along the paper's frayed edge. A promise bound in verse, he repeated, not without a trace of irony. Then, with the kind of procedural thoroughness that comes more naturally to him than to me, he set about tracing the handwriting. It did not take him long. Within a day he had matched it, not to a living person, but to the late Miss Eleanor Chater, secretary to the college bursar in the late 60s. She had died nearly 15 years ago, leaving behind little more than a few relatives in the Midlands and a tidy set of retirement papers. There was no reason on paper for her name to sit alongside Thomas Black's in anything other than the payroll. And yet, I returned to the Bodleian that evening, the reading lamps casting their small pools of light in the dimness. I looked again at the Tennyson inscription, the Latin line, the faint smudge above it. The erasure was too deliberate to be accident, but too careful to leave any readable trace. Whoever had removed the words had not wanted the page defaced, only altered, as one might remove a name from a photograph without tearing the image. When I left, the rain had begun again, fine and cold against the skin. I thought of Eleanor Chater, the promise bound in verse, and the way such promises can stretch across years without breaking, visible only when something as slight as a folded letter happens to fall into view. For 2 days I carried the letter from the Bodleian in my inside pocket, as though proximity might warm it into confession. The words, that promise bound in verse, kept circling back to the faded photograph on the black's mantel, to Lydia Mornay's careful phrasing in the chapel, to the deliberate evasions in St. Simeon's cloisters. It was not a long leap to imagine Thomas Black in the late 60s. Younger, less careful, perhaps already inclined to the sort of passions Lydia had hinted at. An affair with Eleanor Chaytor, discreet enough to evade college gossip but dangerous enough to ruin him if exposed. Years later, someone, perhaps from the same academic circle, discovers it. The Athenian Circle for the Preservation of English Verse, so oddly named, becomes the perfect conduit for a quiet payment. No one looks too closely at a donation made in the name of art. Blackmail has its own poetry, a steady rhythm, the refrain of a threat repeated until compliance becomes second nature. The bequest in the will, timed precisely 2 months before his death, fit neatly into the pattern. Too neatly, perhaps. I asked Lydia to meet me again, choosing a small café just off the high street where the tables were close enough to invite quiet voices. She arrived wearing the same unflustered calm as before, though her eyes seemed fractionally brighter, as if she had already decided how this meeting would go. I told her about the letter in the Tennyson volume. Not in its entirety. I left the phrase promise bound in verse unspoken, but enough to watch her reaction. She did not flinch, only sipped her coffee, and after a pause reached into her bag. She handed me an envelope, the sort sold in university stationers 40 years ago, and still stocked by habit rather than demand. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting firm but softened at the edges by age. It was from Thomas, dated only a few weeks before his death. He thanked her, warmly, unguardedly, for arranging, as he put it, the most honest evening in years. There was nothing in it that could be twisted into evidence of coercion or secrecy. No trace of the fear that would have clung to a man paying off the past. I read it twice, searching for an angle, a tension between the words. There was none. Even the phrasing had a plainness to it, as though the writer had shed, if only briefly, whatever weight he usually carried. Lydia watched me over the rim of her cup. She asked, not unkindly, whether I had thought her capable of blackmail. I said nothing. Silence, in my experience, is rarely more revealing than in the moments when speech would be too easy. She stood to leave, sliding the chair back with the kind of finality that belongs more to theatre than conversation. The letter remained on the table between us, until I placed it back in the envelope and handed it to her. She slipped it into her bag without looking at it again. Walking back through the covered market, I felt the theory I had been nursing collapse with the peculiar stillness of something falling in deep water. The affair, if there had been one, might still have mattered. The bequest might still have been the key. But the neat thread of blackmail, so temptingly plausible, had unravelled into loose ends. There is a particular fatigue that comes when a theory dies. Not the sharp frustration of error, but the slower weariness of having believed in something long enough to see its outline sharpen, only to watch it dissolve in the simplest of proofs. That evening I poured a whiskey I didn't particularly want and let it sit on the desk beside an unfinished crossword. The clue at 9 down, recant, withdraw, as from a statement, 6, remained unanswered, though I had a word in mind that seemed to fit. It was resign, and it felt uncomfortably close to what I had just done. Good to play immediately, a small, unvoiced satisfaction as we walked up the path to the Black's house again. Margaret received us with the same studied composure as before, though the faint scent of lavender in the hall seemed heavier now, as if it had been applied in haste. The diary lay on a writing desk in the front room, its black cover rubbed smooth at the corners. Margaret stood at a polite distance while Lewis explained our interest. She said her husband had kept it faithfully for years. Daily notes, never elaborate, just the small record of an orderly life. When I turned to the final month, the pages were filled in his neat slanting hand. Weather reports, the occasional visitor, what they had eaten for supper. But for the night of his death there was nothing, not merely blank, but gone. The leaf had been neatly removed, the thread binding between the pages still taut, the cut too clean for accident. Margaret said she had burned it, in grief. Some words, she said, are not meant to be reread when the writer is gone. Her voice did not waver, but there was a faint tension at the corner of her mouth, like a thread pulled tight against the fabric. I closed the book, but not before noticing the shallow rectangular depression in the paper of the page before and after, the ghost of something once there. A heavier pen, perhaps, pressing through the thin paper. As I replaced the diary on the desk, something slipped from the back cover. An envelope, cream paper, addressed in a hand I recognized from earlier in the week. Inside, on college stationery, was a dinner invitation from Dr. Adrian Selwyn, dated for the very evening Thomas Black had died. Margaret said nothing, merely looked at the envelope as if it had been there all along, its significance neither denied nor admitted. We found Selwyn in his rooms, the afternoon light cutting narrow angles across his desk. I laid the invitation before him. He smiled, that same practiced, convivial smile, and said yes, he had invited Thomas, a long-standing arrangement to discuss a small translation project. But Thomas had not come. At 6:30, Selwyn claimed he had received a telephone call, Thomas apologizing, saying something had come up at home, though no reason was given. Selwyn had dined alone, and the evening had been otherwise unremarkable. The answer was smooth enough, but the pauses between his phrases were just long enough to feel arranged. I asked whether the call had sounded urgent. He said it had sounded final. Back in the quad, Lewis and I stood under the dripping eaves. He was inclined to believe Selwyn's version. The man had offered the story without prompting, and there was no obvious reason to invent it. I was less certain. A last-minute change of plan, an empty page in a diary, a dinner never attended. These things do not cluster by accident. As we left the college, the bells from the chapel began their slow toll for evensong, each note dissolving into the damp air before the next began. I found myself wondering whether Thomas had meant to go to that dinner, or whether the invitation had been a pretext for something else entirely. Something recorded in a page now missing, burned perhaps, but not forgotten. The diary, even without that single leaf, had the feel of a map with one road erased, and I have never trusted maps that invite you to look elsewhere. The porter at St. Simeon's was the kind who collected scraps of gossip like cigarette cards. He caught Lewis in the quad just before dusk, voice lowered as if the gargoyles might be listening. "Mr. Vale's been spending a bit more freely of late. New watch, nice shoes. Reckon he's had a windfall." Morse listened with an expression that suggested polite disinterest, but his mind sharpened. Peter Vale, bursary clerk, former gambling habit, and now, apparently, flush with cash. It slotted neatly into a motive. If Thomas Black had threatened to expose Vale's debts, a quick death might have been cheaper than repayment. Back in his office, Morse flipped through the bursary accounts that Lewis had borrowed under the pretense of routine auditing. Tucked halfway through, he found the figure he was hunting, a loan to Vale, written off just 3 weeks before Thomas's death. The notation in the margin, a terse closed by order of the bursar, practically hummed with intrigue. By the following morning, Morse had spun his theory to perfection. Vale kills Thomas to ensure the debt is never resurrected. The bequest to the Poetry Society? A red herring, or perhaps a coincidental quirk of an aging man's eccentricities? Lewis was less convinced. "Even if he wanted rid of the debt, sir, that's a lot of risk just to—" Morse waved him into silence. "There's no such thing as coincidence in murder, Lewis. The only variable is how many detours the truth takes before we arrive at it." The detour began with a bookmaker in Cowley, a dreary little shop with a window streaked by rain, smelling faintly of old carpet and tobacco. Inside, the proprietor, a broad-shouldered man with a face that had weathered many unwise wagers, remembered Vale. "Yes, he paid off what he owed me. Clean slate now. Came in grinning, handed over the lot in 50s. Didn't say where he got it from, mind." "Did he strike you as a man under pressure?" Morse asked. The bookmaker shrugged. "Only from his daughter. Wouldn't shut up about her big night. Some school concert thing. Said he had to leave early to get a decent seat." The alibi was more solid than Morse would have liked. Lewis confirmed it within hours. Vale's presence at the recital had been witnessed by 6 parents, a music teacher, and, most damningly, the headmistress herself, who provided the exact program he had clutched all evening like a talisman. Standing in the corridor of the school, the sound of a choir rehearsal drifting faintly from the hall, Morse felt the elegant shape of his theory crumple. The bookmaker's testimony and the recital witnesses left no room for the kind of discreet murder he'd imagined. Back in the Jaguar, Morse sat with his head against the rest, staring through the windscreen as rain began to fall in thin, needling lines. Lewis watched him for a moment before venturing, "Back to square one, sir?" "Back to somewhere," Morse muttered. "Square one suggests we ever knew where we were." They drove in silence until Lewis, trying to shift the gloom, remarked that at least they could cross Vale off the list. Morse gave a thin smile. "Crossing off suspects, Lewis, is the surest way to find oneself with no one left to suspect. And then where would we be?" "Probably in the pub," Lewis said. "That," Morse conceded, "is the first sensible thing you've said all day." But even as they walked toward the King's Arms, Morse's mind kept circling back, not to Vale, but to the look in Mr. Eden's eyes at the solicitor's office, and to that crossword clue still folded in his pocket. Somewhere, beneath the false trails and tidy alibis, the real shape of the thing was waiting. He only hoped he'd see it before another name from the photograph found its way into an obituary. The notice was lying where he'd left it days earlier, folded between the pages of his notebook, a faint crease worn soft from handling. Morse took it out again, flattening it beneath his hand on the table. The couplet from In Memoriam stared back at him, and for the first time in hours he let himself really read it, the rhythm rolling gently in his mind like the beat of oars. "Whatever my grief, my love remains, though all is shadow and life disdains." Only it wasn't quite Tennyson, was it? That second line had always jarred. The true line was different. Morse knew the original as surely as he knew the taste of his first pint. Somewhere in that misstep lay intention. He copied the notice onto a fresh page, then, almost idly, wrote the first letter of each word down the margin. The pen halted after 6 letters. Lydia. Morse sat back in his chair. The radiator clanked in the corner of the flat. Outside, a delivery lorry reversed down the narrow street. Lydia Mornay. The coincidence was too neat, the letters too deliberate. Someone had wanted him, or someone, to see her name hiding in plain sight. By early evening, the drizzle over Oxford had thickened into rain, turning the stone flags of St. Simeon's Quad to dark mirrors. Lydia answered her door at the third knock, a scarf wound high at her neck. "Morse," she said, her voice just a little too bright. "Sorry to disturb your evening," he replied, stepping past the threshold at her gesture. The sitting room was warm, smelling faintly of bergamot tea and the faint dustiness of old music scores piled on the sideboard. He took the notice from his coat pocket and held it out. "Do you read Tennyson often, Miss Mornay?" Her fingers closed on the slip, but she did not look down immediately. "Why do you ask?" "Because whoever wrote this didn't quote him. They changed a word or two, and if you take the first letter of each word, you get... well, I imagine you know what you get." She looked then, and her hands trembled just enough to rattle the paper. A silence pressed in between them. Finally she said, "He told me you were clever." Morse did not move. "How long had you and Thomas Black known each other?" Her eyes flicked away toward the rain-streaked window. "Decades. Since 68, if you must know. I was barely 22. He was married, but he said he loved me. We were foolish enough to believe. The years would wait for us." "And the marriage?" "He wanted to leave her. Margaret knew. She always knew. But promises made in youth don't always stand the weather." She smiled, but there was no mirth in it. "We drifted apart. Then a few years ago, he sought me out again. Said he'd grown tired of pretending. That he wanted..." She broke off, smoothing the scarf at her throat. "It doesn't matter now." "It matters to me," Morse said quietly. "You quarrelled." Her eyes widened, startled at the certainty in his voice. "Yes, the night before he died. Old wounds, and they bleed again when you pick at them. He accused me of caring more for my reputation than for him. I accused him of cowardice. We said things." She drew a slow breath. "I went to his house that night to apologize. I saw the light in his study, but I couldn't make myself knock. I left." "And he was alive when you left?" She held his gaze. "Yes. I swear it." Morse studied her a long moment, weighing the tremor in her voice, the quickness with which she'd admitted the visit. Guilt clung to her, yes, but guilt for words, perhaps, not for poison. Still, the acrostic in the obituary lingered in his mind like a faint perfume. When he left her rooms, the rain had stopped, and somewhere beyond the darkened quad a single bell tolled the hour. He had more questions now than when he'd arrived, and the answers, as ever, were keeping themselves to themselves. The August light had turned a pale, almost anemic gold by the time Morse and Lewis returned to the Blacks' house. Margaret received them with a tight smile, the kind that seemed pressed into service rather than freely given. "I can't think what more there is to see," she said, voice clipped. "You've been through it all before." Morse shrugged, feigning the weary persistence of a man running out of patience, though in truth his mind was sharpening to a single point. "Humour us, Mrs. Black. There are things I sometimes see more clearly the second time." Margaret's lips parted, then closed again, a retort abandoned. She stood aside to let them in. They moved through the drawing-room, the air faintly scented with lavender. The source was a small chest of drawers beneath the window, the same one Morse had noticed on his first visit, though at the time it had seemed merely part of the domestic background. On top, a volume of poetry leaned slightly forward, as though nudged by an unseen hand. It was this, more than anything, that had drawn him back. He lifted the book, a slim, leather-bound anthology, and let it fall open. A single folded sheet, creased at the edges, lay between its pages. Lewis leaned over his shoulder. "That's his handwriting." Morse unfolded the page, his eyes narrowing as he read. The diary entry was brief, a few sentences scratched in a hand that had pressed hard into the paper. Michaelmas Eve. Discovered the truth about Margaret's accounts at the charity. Cannot, will not, let this go. Tonight we speak plainly. Below, in the margin, a final note in the same hand. If anything should happen to me. The remainder had been violently scored through, the paper torn. Lewis exhaled. So he knew. Morse did not reply at once. He moved instead to the sideboard where a half-empty brown bottle sat among the decanters. He picked it up, tilting it toward the light. "Sleeping draught," he said quietly. "Prescribed dosage, 10 milliliters at night, enough to lull you into dreamless oblivion, but twice that." He let the thought hang. Margaret's voice came from the doorway. "You've no right." Morse turned slowly, holding the bottle in one hand, the diary page in the other. "Thomas confronted you that night. He'd found the missing funds. You knew if he exposed you there would be no polite retreat. So you poured a little more into his glass than the doctor ordered, just enough that his heart, tired as it was, would never quite find its way back to morning." Her face was pale, but her chin lifted in defiance. "You can't prove that." "Perhaps not to a jury," Morse said. "But we both know the truth, and so did you, when you invented the story of the poetry bequest, a neat little fiction to explain why you needed to move certain moneys around without anyone asking awkward questions." The silence between them was taut. Outside, the evening bells of St. Giles drifted faintly through the open window. Lewis spoke at last. "Mrs. Black, I'll have to ask you to come with us." Margaret looked past him, out to the garden where the fading roses hung their heads. For a moment Morse thought she might protest. Instead, she simply said, "It was never meant to be like this." They left the house in near silence. In the car, Lewis asked, "What gave it away?" Morse kept his eyes on the road. "The lavender. She said she kept it in the drawer to scent the linen, but the book wasn't linen. It was bait, set just ajar in case someone came looking, almost as if she wanted the truth found once it was too late to matter." Lewis frowned. "Guilt? Or vanity?" Morse said, shifting into third. "You'd be surprised how often they share a bed." They drove on, the spires of Oxford rising ahead, the city holding its evening light like a secret that would not be told. The house was still, curtains drawn, lamps low, the air heavy with the faint, medicinal scent of dried lavender. Margaret Black sat at the escritoire in her drawing-room, her posture immaculate, a silver hairpin keeping her chignon in place. A small cut-glass decanter and 2 balloon glasses waited on the tray beside her. Morse did not sit at once. He stood just inside the doorway, letting the quiet fill the space between them. Lewis was waiting in the car outside. "I thought," Margaret said at last, "that you might prefer port to whiskey." Morse moved to the armchair opposite. "I'm not here for a drink, Mrs. Black," she smiled faintly. "Then you will forgive me if I pour one for myself." The rich liquid caught the lamplight as she filled the glasses with an unhurried hand. "I assume you've come to tell me that the little subterfuge has run its course." Morse leaned forward. "I've come to tell you I found the diary page, the one you tore out and hid inside the poetry book." Her gaze did not flicker. Thomas had beautiful handwriting. It seemed a shame for anyone to read those words and misunderstand them. "They were quite clear to me," Morse replied. He'd discovered the charity accounts, the withdrawals, the falsified ledgers, and he meant to make it public. Margaret sipped her port. "Thomas was many things, Inspector. Discreet was not one of them." Morse's voice softened. "So you gave him more of his draft than the doctor intended." She set the glass down, fingertips resting lightly on its rim. "I prefer to think of it as granting him silence, a reprieve from our mutual disappointments." "You didn't consider leaving?" Her smile thinned. "Leave what?" "An empty house, a dwindling bank account, a name I'd spent decades preserving. Thomas and I understood each other too well to play at melodrama. Besides," she reached for the decanter and refilled her glass, "I had no intention of living with the humiliation of his affairs becoming a matter of public gossip. One must keep something, Inspector, even if it is only dignity." They sat in quiet for a moment, the fire murmuring in the grate. "You invented the bequest to the Poetry Society," Morse said at last. "A convenient fiction to cover the missing funds." "A fiction," she agreed, "but a rather elegant one. Thomas would have liked it in his way. It tied off the loose ends neatly." Morse regarded her, thinking how much she resembled the portraits in the college hall. Women whose entire existence had been a careful negotiation between appearance and necessity. "You could have denied it," he said. "You could have burned the page." "And leave you without an ending to your story?" She looked at him almost kindly. "I thought perhaps you would understand. A marriage is its own mystery, Inspector, and sometimes the conclusion is not for outsiders to applaud or condemn." Morse took the glass she had poured for him earlier. The port was deep, almost black in the lamplight. "I understand more than you think," he said quietly. Outside, a car door closed. Footsteps approached the house. Margaret did not glance toward the sound. She finished her port in a single, graceful motion and placed the empty glass beside its twin on the tray. Lewis's knock came, polite but firm. Margaret rose, smoothed her skirt, and walked to the door with the composure of a hostess receiving a late guest. When Lewis stepped inside, she extended her wrists, without prompting. "Do be careful with the cuffs," she murmured. "The dress is silk." Morse remained by the fire, watching the two of them pass through the doorway. On the tray, the glasses caught the last of the firelight, two small pools of garnet in the growing dark. The rain had fallen in the night, a thin silver sheen still clinging to the cobblestones of St. Simeon's. The college cloisters smelled faintly of wet stone and old leaves, the kind that had lodged themselves in corners and gutters and would remain there until spring. Morse walked without purpose. His limp was more noticeable in damp weather, but he made no effort to hide it. It was a day for small discomforts, the sort one accepted with the same fatalism Margaret Black had shown in her final conversation. In the quadrangle, a porter tipped his cap but received no acknowledgement. Morse's gaze was fixed somewhere far beyond the high medieval walls. His hands were deep in his pockets, fingers worrying the edge of a folded newspaper. The Oxford Mail, still creased to the in memoriam notice. The misquoted Tennyson no longer puzzled him. He knew now why the letters spelled what they did. A faint glimmer caught his eye as he passed the chapel. High in the tower, the bell ropes were moving. From within came the slow, uneven peal of the saint. Simeon's bells. The sound seemed to falter, as though the ringer were uncertain of the next note, hesitant in grief or memory. He stopped in the archway, half hidden in shadow. Margaret would be in prison by now, awaiting the machinery of trial and sentence. Her confession, given over a decanter of port, had been free of theatrics, devoid of the passion he had come to expect in such moments. She had spoken as if reading from an account ledger, her voice carrying neither pride nor shame. Lydia Vale, on the other hand, had refused to speak to him again. He could hardly blame her. She had given him the truth she knew, and it had availed her nothing. Somewhere in Jericho, perhaps, she sat alone with her books, nursing the quiet ache of an old love, wondering if Thomas had ever truly intended to leave Margaret. Morse took the newspaper from his pocket and smoothed it against the damp stone. He traced the misquote with his thumb, the ink faintly smudging. Then, almost without thinking, he drew the small blue volume of In Memoriam from his coat, the same copy he had found on Thomas's shelf weeks ago. It fell open on its own to a well-thumbed page. He read the correct couplet aloud, softly, as if speaking to the empty cloister. "Forgive what seemed my sin in me, what seemed my worth since I began." No acrostic here, no concealed names. Just the measured voice of the poet, clear and direct, unburdened by riddles. A gust of wind stirred the cloister, carrying with it the faint tang of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the walls. The bells above gave one last uncertain toll, then fell silent. The absence of sound seemed deeper for the momentary interruption, the way silence in a concert hall feels more profound after a single sustained note. He lingered there, listening to the gentle patter of rain as it returned, soft and insistent, pooling in the uneven flagstones. His fingers curled around the poetry volume until the leather warmed against his palm. Somewhere in his mind, half-formed, was the thought that he should call Lewis, or perhaps even go back to the station. Instead, he remained where he was, letting the quiet settle over him like a slow exhalation. The investigation was over. The paperwork would take care of itself. Above, the clouds closed in again. Morse turned up his collar and stepped back into the quadrangle. The bells did not resume. Only the rain remained, falling in even measure, its rhythm oddly like the ticking of a clock that no one had wound for years. He passed the porter once more, still without a word. At the gate, he paused and glanced back at the chapel tower, its outline softened by the mist. Somewhere in its stone heart, the ropes lay slack, waiting for another day, another call to be answered. Morse walked on, the newspaper folded once more in his pocket, the poem still resting in his hand. The rain did not let up.